Amid soaring inflation, protests on the streets and a media crackdown, the two sides of a polarized Venezuela, government and opposition, have accepted the Pope's request to sit down for talks. But what's happened to the leftist revolution that the late Hugo Chavez launched in 1999? And what should Venezuela do now? Before the announcement of the talks, I sat down with Temir Porras, the former chief of staff for Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and a former advisor to the late President Chavez, and economist Ricardo Hausmann, director of Harvard Center for International Development and a former Minister of Planning in Venezuela in the early 1990s. Earlier this year, he wrote it's probably too late to avoid a Venezuelan catastrophe altogether. So I began by asking him what caused the catastrophe.
Well, I mean, I said that in January, and the catastrophe is here. That's what is making Venezuela so newsworthy lately. I think essentially what happened is that President Hugo Chavez used the period of high oil prices not to put some money aside, but to quintuple the foreign debt. So then the year of his election, when the price of oil was at 100, he was spending as if the price of oil was at 200, running a huge deficit. So then markets stopped lending to the country, so they could no longer afford to be spending as if the price of oil was at 200 and borrow the difference. And now the price of oil is at 40 or so for the Venezuelan crude.
Okay, let Temir Porras come in there and respond to some of that.
Inflation.
I think that mainly the problem is that you have been predicting that catastrophe for 17 years. I mean, when the government in Venezuela was doing well, they were already predicting a catastrophe. When I think there's a lot of ideological points of view in there. You're mixing, the President Chavez's term with the actual situation of Venezuela. You're saying that the debt was quintupled while you don't mention the fact that the GDP of the country was multiplied by 3. The country is not over-indebted. The GDP to debt ratio is lower than in many developed countries. It's not a problem of amount of debt. It's a problem of management of that debt. I mean, Venezuela has issues with accessing.
Before I bring Ricardo back in, let me ask you to answer the same question I asked him. What is behind this current crisis? Surely you would accept there is a crisis right now in Venezuela. Of course. So what's caused it?
Unlike Ricardo Hausmann, I live in Caracas, so of course there's no issue about that. There has been a sharp fall in oil prices, and there has been, I would say, a management of that crisis that has been deficient to my opinion. But linking, this ideological idea that the left in Venezuela is not viable, that the Chavista project has failed, while it managed to secure at least 10 years of GDP growth, managed to secure the reduction of 49% in inequalities and in poverty. I mean, globally, the Chavista project is a success in Venezuela that is going through very, very tough times today.
Okay. Are you saying that the entire project is a failure because of the current catastrophe, despite all the gains that Temir outlines?
I mean, Temir is entitled to his own opinions. He's not entitled to his own facts. He said that the debt of Venezuela is not very big. Venezuela has a public foreign debt of $150 billion. $150 billion. Venezuela exports about $25 billion, maybe $30 billion. So the foreign debt is 6 years of exports. That is a huge debt. That is one of the biggest debts in the world. That is the reason why financial markets don't want to lend to Venezuela anymore. And that's the reason why Venezuela needs to restructure its debt and seek financial assistance. But this government has decided that they don't want to go there.
Exactly
they would rather default on the Venezuelan
Venezuela
period.
should go to the IMF. I mean, is the old neoliberal recipe the only thing we have to give to the Venezuelan people?
Well, I mean, you can give starvation and hunger and inflation and so on. I mean, look at what you've done.
The foreign news reports right now of Venezuela tend to paint quite harrowing scenes of food shortages, food riots, Venezuelans without medicine. Is that inaccurate?
I mean, there is a crisis. There is an economic crisis in Venezuela. What is inaccurate is to depict Venezuela as Ethiopia when it run food shortages. The problem in Venezuela is not the lack of food, it's not the lack of supply. I live in Venezuela and they eat. It's a problem of pricing. I mean, inflation is very high, and it's very hard for people.
It's going to hit 700% according to some studies.
How do you know that? Where does that figure? Professor Hausmann keeps saying that there are no official figures, and he's probably right.
What do you think the inflation rate is?
No, it's very high, but
what is it?
Why?
If it's not 700,
I don't have a crystal ball.
You're saying
to
it's
say
not 700.
It's absolutely. I mean,
it's going to hit 700 as a prediction.
Inaccurate to predict.
Okay, let me ask Ricardo Hausmann this question.
Like
you were obviously you were a minister of planning back in the early 90s in one of the predecessor governments prior to Chavez coming to power, and that government took IMF money, did structural reforms. I think they liberalised petrol prices. People took to the streets. They were shot at. They were killed. Hundreds were killed in those protests. You talk about freedoms being extinguished now. That happened on your watch too.
It didn't happen on my watch.
Well, it happened under the watch of the president you served, President Perez.
First of all, let's get some points clear. If Venezuela was such a democracy, we wouldn't have over 100 political prisoners. If Venezuela was so full of food, there wouldn't be hundreds of thousands of people a week crossing the border to Colombia to buy food.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Temir to respond to all of that, but only after you respond to my question, which is, when your president was in power, the president you served, who was then impeached under corruption charges, he sent out the army to shoot at people who were protesting over high petrol prices. It wasn't some utopia when you were in government, is what I'm saying.
It was the period similar to this one, where there was a decline in the oil price. The previous government had not saved the money.
And the president you served shot at hundreds of people in the street. Did people not die in the Caracas?
How can it be similar when you had a center-left, or allegedly center-left, president implementing right-wing politics?
This is Carlos Andrés Perez.
Carlos Andrés Perez,
this is
absolutely.
not right-wing politics.
This is the reason.
This is the policies of what happens when you run out of oil and you didn't make your savings. And that is the same catastrophe that is currently being lived in Venezuela.
When you do not care about your national sovereignty, and when you're ready to handle...
What national sovereignty? The only thing you care about is paying the Wall Street bonds and screwing the Venezuelan people. That's what you call sovereignty.
Well, I mean...
Do you agree with him on the debt?
Absolutely not. I do not agree on the debt. He's lobbying for his friends who are enjoying the subsidized dollars for imports. I've been shocked how you, when you depict these food shortages, you mainly speak about beer and Coca-Cola. I have read that 3 times. You're depicting Venezuela as if it were an economy owned by the state. It's mainly a privately owned economy, and I think it's one of the problems, the attitude of the private sector in Venezuela.
Just also deal with the political point that Ricardo Hausmann raised.
Which made huge amounts of money during the oil.
Just deal with the point Ricardo Hausmann raised about political prisoners.
I wouldn't call that a situation of political prisoners. You should know that Leopoldo López and the other people who are in prison today are people who were willing to overthrow the government and took concrete actions to that. I do not mean, in my personal opinion, the judiciary shouldn't solve political problems.
But you are aware that international human rights groups have written some pretty scathing reports about
international human rights
treatment of prisoners, treatment of the media, treatment of protesters.
That do not criticize the parliamentary coup in Brazil, that only advocate for some causes and are biased in their views of the countries depending on where they are situated. Yes, the thing is that, in my personal opinion, the judiciary shouldn't step in to solve Venezuela's political problems.
Okay, well,
and that's
let me put this point to Ricardo Hausmann. You're
solution. Obviously,
given your past, you were in government before. A lot of people might say, well, you just want to turn the clock back. You want to kind of eliminate all of the gains that Chavez and Chavismo did make. Clearly, there were gains in terms of cuts in poverty, cuts in inequality, new schools, etc., etc.
Investing the oil money in the people.
Is that, what would you say to those critics who say you want to turn back the clock?
Why turn back the clock? The world has moved on. Right?
Positively in some ways in Venezuela. You would accept that, right?
Absolutely. Well, not in Venezuela.
Not in Venezuela. There were no gains made on the social, economic, child poverty, inequality fronts at all.
Well, the government has stopped publishing poverty statistics. But the consortium, the government of Maduro stopped in 2014, stopped publishing.
But Chavez died in 2013.
Numbers.
Just talking about the Chavez period.
Yes, but
you would accept that there were social economic gains made on his watch.
I think those gains were based on $100 oil and $100 a year in borrowing.
Fair enough.
That we cannot
But the gains
anymore.
were made. But they were gains. Poor people's lives improved. That's all I'm asking.
People's lives unsustainably improved. They destroy unsustainably improved. That's why we're in a crisis now.
They're all being undone now. Those gains are being undone.
Absolutely.
Dramatically so. Dramatically
I mean,
so.
you're pretending that those gains, which are profound, I mean, absolutely not. I mean, that oil money was invested in what? In education?
Why are so many Venezuelans leaving the country? Why is now the Dominican Republic, Panama, Colombia, Chile,
because
Spain, they're all
there's a
leaving the
huge
country?
economic
Why?
I
crisis.
want to ask you one question before we end. A year from now, 2 years from now, what is the state of Venezuela's economy going to be? I'm going to start with you, Ricardo.
Well, if Maduro is out soon, I think that we can turn the country around relatively quickly with sound economic
Soon
policies
with a coup d'etat,
supported by the international financial community and supported by the people who, from a majority
sound economic policies being balanced budgets, austerity.
It means freeing people to be able to own their things, to invest, and to have face reasonable
Temir, what's the economy going to look like?
You're depicting a state-run economy. I mean, I, as any other Venezuelan citizens, own my things in Venezuela. Please come from time to time to see we're not a communist economy. Venezuela is going through hard times.
What's it going to look like going forward, a year, 2 years from now?
Well, if we do not accept that radical approach that depicts the country as collapsing and people start to get together and tackle the real issues and not think that getting rid of your political adversaries is going to bring about stability, things will be better.
Who's putting political adversaries in jail?
And who is calling for a
referendum? Ask the people to get rid of Maduro.
The only referendum in Venezuela was held in 2004, and you called it a fraud, while the OAS and the Carter Center said it was valid. So once again, there's a lot of mistrust in Venezuela. We have to build trust and focus on the real issues.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.